Hello, and welcome to this interview in connection with the Global Security Reform Initiative. My colleague, Heike Hovanes, and I, Ryan Swan, proposers of the Global Security Reform Initiative, will pose some questions relating to the past, present, and future of the global peace movement to world-renowned professor and leading public intellectual, Dr. Noam Chomsky. In addition to his groundbreaking work in linguistics, Professor Chomsky has played a leading role in diverse areas of international peace advocacy for more than 6 decades. It is our great pleasure, privilege, and honor to have the opportunity to conduct this interview with him. Professor, thank you so much for your time, and we really look forward to the ensuing conversation.
Very pleased to be with you.
Thank you. Without further delay, let's get started. I invite Mr. Hovanes to pose the first question.
Thanks, Ryan, and thank you, Professor Chomsky, for this very important opportunity. The interwar period saw ambitious efforts to oppose militarism. After World War II, however, the nuclear weapons-based militarized national security model became firmly entrenched, and peace advocacy efforts have been downgraded to a preoccupation with limiting militarism's most dangerous manifestations. How do you assess the track record of global peace advocacy efforts post-World War II? What have been the strengths and weaknesses?
Well, we are now approaching the 77th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima. A few days from now, August 6th. It's very much what you said. There were attempts early on to try to establish some kind of a treaty which would prevent the further development of nuclear weapons. Failed. The commitment since has been to try to, of the peace movement, to try to limit their destructive capacity. The Non-Proliferation Treaty was a step forward. It did limit to some extent, not entirely, the expansion of nuclear weapons. So included, crucially, Article 6, a proviso that the nuclear powers must undertake good faith efforts to eliminate nuclear weapons. Well, that hasn't been done. We just a couple of weeks ago had the first meeting of the treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons, total prohibition. The treaty is now in force. The United Nations Treaty just had its first introductory conference, signed by roughly 120 countries, none of the nuclear powers. None of them have been willing to sign. It has to be done. If you look over the record of the last, in fact, things are going backwards. There have been laborious efforts ever since Eisenhower to try to establish some kind of an international regime which would limit the threat, not end it, but limit it. So Eisenhower's open skies proposal. Now that had an effect. It reduced the likelihood of a nuclear launch taken out of ignorance because he thought the adversary was going to do something. At least the information was available. Well, that was ended by Donald Trump, pulled out of the Open Skies Treaty, Eisenhower's treaty. There have been other steps forward. 1987, Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev signed the INF Treaty, which banned short-range nuclear missiles in Europe. terrible threat. Barely a couple of minutes to respond. Okay, they were banned. President Trump dismantled the INF Treaty. We should remember, incidentally, that the INF Treaty didn't come out of nowhere. A large factor behind it was an energized, organized, active peace movement. There were huge protests in Europe, in the United States. I think the biggest protests in US history in the early 80s, which set the stage for Reagan to agree to Gorbachev's proposals to end that very dangerous threat, short-term missiles. Trump pulled out of it, and to make it very clear to the Russians that he meant what he was doing, within days after the US abrogation of the treaty, the Pentagon set off a short-run missile which violated the treaty, telling the Russians, we mean it. You better develop arms to counter this. Let's race off to destruction. The Bush II administration had started this process of dismantling the regime for armament control by abandoning the ABM treaty, anti-ballistic missiles treaty. That sounds on paper like a defensive weapon. Every strategic analyst knows it's a first strike weapon, ABMs. Inconceivable that any ABM system imaginable could stop a first strike. Absolutely inconceivable. Nobody dreams of it. Maybe Reagan believed it, but nobody else does. Theoretically, ABMs might be able to limit a retaliatory strike. But what that means is they're a first strike weapon. They are there to maybe fend off a retaliatory strike. Furthermore, if you take a look at the ABM facilities that the US has been advancing near the Russian border, they're dual use. The technology in them can be converted very easily to offensive missiles. Well, the United States says we don't have any intention of doing that, but obviously Russian strategists can't take that as a sufficient guarantee. So allowing ABM installations to be installed, especially right near the Russian border, is a highly provocative move. Just as eliminating the INF treaty, it's a major threat to Russia. NATO can say all it likes, we're defensive, we don't do anything. How is any adversary supposed to believe that? Especially when NATO actually has a long record of aggression. Well, that's what's been happening in the last couple of years. Trump was just about to eliminate the last treaty, the New START treaty, which limits Russian and American missiles way above what they ought to be, but at least to put some limit. That was due to expire on February 5th of this year. Biden got in just in time, within days, to accept Russian offers to extend the treaty for another 5 years. That last one was barely saved. Republicans coming back into office, the possibility of arms control or of climate control is decreasing rapidly. So just when we should be moving in the direction that you're working on to eliminate the threat, when we should be working on that, we're moving to expanding the threat. Now, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has sharply increased these dangers. The criminal invasion, unjustified, a terrible tragedy for Ukraine, but it also sets the stage for escalation. Easy to think of steps that could lead to escalation. take just one of many. Russia so far has not attacked the supply lines that are bringing weapons into Ukraine from the West, mostly the US. It hasn't, it's left them alone. Well, suppose it decides to attack them. And then it's almost in a confrontation with NATO. Can move beyond, get to a real confrontation. It's, you can read this morning's paper, read a column by a US strategist, Max Boot, saying, we should expand the war in Ukraine, use all the force we have, we're way beyond the Russians in military force, and we have to drive them out and defeat them. And we can be certain that they're not going to use the weapons that they have to defend themselves. How can we be certain? Because I say so. Trust me, I say so. That's enough. So let's move on and gamble with the lives of Ukrainians and with the fate of the world. Gamble that the Russians won't use the weapons that we know they have to fend off defeat. That's considered rational discourse in our society. I don't know what the words are. Can you think of a word for that? Insane, lunatic, and they're much too weak. But that's going on all the time. And in fact, if you look closely, that's formal US policy. It was established firmly at a meeting at the Ramstein Air Base a month or two ago. The United States called the NATO powers to a US air base in Germany, laid down the law stated by the Secretary of Defense. We continue to fight this war in order to weaken Russia. In fact, to weaken Russia so severely that it will not be able to carry out any further aggressive acts. Well, think for 30 seconds. What does that mean? There was a treaty in Versailles in 1919, which was aimed to weaken Germany so that it couldn't carry out aggression. Did it work? No, it didn't work, wasn't severe enough. So what the United States is saying, we have to do something more severe than the Versailles Treaty, which led to Nazism in the Second World War. That's official US policy. Official policy. Let's go on, move to another side of the world. For 40 years, the Taiwan issue has been basically controlled by a tacit agreement between the United States and China, just not to rock the boat. US agrees that in principle, Taiwan is part of China, but it's not going to do anything about it. And China agrees we won't do anything about it. Well, that's kept the peace. Nancy Pelosi just announced that she's going to make a high-level diplomatic vision to China. Highly provocative act. Absolutely no purpose of it except to enhance her own standing as a brave, courageous hawk. I can be as tough as the crazy men are. Nothing beyond that. Will China respond? Well, let's hope not, because then we're off on another escalatory ladder. But that's what's going on in high places. I should say that in the Pelosi case, the Pentagon is urging her not to go. The Biden administration is urging her not to go, but it looks like she's going to go. I mean, we're living in a world where leaders and strategic analysts, the people who advise them, just can't think. I mean, it's beyond dangerous. We're dealing with the survival of the human species. If you look over the record for the last 75 years, you look closely, it's kind of a miracle that we've survived. Time and time again, we've come very close to nuclear war, and that means terminal war. Very close, sometimes by reckless acts of leaders, often just by accident. The warning systems miscalculated. They thought there was a missile strike. It turned out to be some lunar event in Norway or something. There was a point when Secretary of Defense Perry was lifting up the phone to call President Carter to tell him we're under attack by missiles. You have to decide whether to launch an attack. Well, last second, he was called by the military officers who said, sorry, it was a mistake. We had the wrong computer tape in the system. I mean, there were major, and during the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a moment when John F. Kennedy had called a quarantine banning Russian vessels from a certain area around Cuba. That's illegal under international law, but he did it. There were Russian submarines there, old submarines, not even designed for the Caribbean. They were designed for the Arctic. They didn't have cooling systems. Sailors inside the submarines were practically dying from asphyxiation. They were being attacked by US destroyers. They thought a war had started. One of the commanders decided, look, we're at war. Instead of just being killed, let's send off our missiles, which were nuclear tipped. If they had sent off their missiles, we'd probably be finished, not be here. Would lead to retaliation. It's the end. He, according to the protocols, he had to have the agreement of two officers in order to do it. One of them said yes, the other said no. Vladimir Arkhipov. It's because of that we're alive today. I mean, you can't continue like this. Miracles don't persist. And now that we're making it more dangerous by eliminating the arms control regime, it's much worse. The kinds of things you're talking about are essential. We have to overcome this lunacy of not even trying to limit the threats. We have to move towards getting rid of them, get rid of this scourge. It's not a very radical position. A couple of years ago, there was a statement by 4 leading figures, not doves: Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, Reagan's Defense Secretary of State, William Perry, a leading figure in the military system, Defense Secretary, Sam Nunn, Senate's main specialist on arms control issues. They called for eliminating nuclear weapons, getting rid of our nuclear weapons. Nothing short of that is acceptable. We have to go and do that. And how to do it? It's going to be hard work in the face of the kinds of circumstances we're facing.
Indeed. Professor, what do you see as the root cause or causes of militarism today?
Well, it's a very interesting question. It's certainly not rational. In fact, if we look back at the record, it's startling what we find. Even scholarship has ignored it. So let's go back to the late 40s again. In the late 1940s, the United States had a level of security that was beyond anything in history. The United States controlled the Western Hemisphere totally, controlled both oceans totally, controlled the opposite sides of both oceans. It was the richest country in the world. It had gained enormously during the war Industrial production quadrupled. Other industrial societies had been devastated. I mean, the position of security was almost indescribable. There'd never been anything like that. There was one potential threat. Potential didn't exist. ICBMs with hydrogen bomb warheads. Hydrogen bombs were a couple of years later, nuclear warheads. That was the one threat to American security. How is it dealt with? Well, there's a definitive study of this. McGeorge Bundy, National Security Advisor for Kennedy and Johnson, wrote the major work on the US strategic posture. He was given access to the highest level declassified materials. He gets to this question, spends about a paragraph on it. He says, looking through all the records, he could find nothing, not even a draft paper not submitted, which said, let's try to do something about the one security threat we face. Let's try to have a treaty with the Russians not to develop ICBMs. They didn't exist then. They probably would have agreed. They were way behind. But it simply never occurred to a single person, even a clerk, maybe we should try to eliminate the one threat to our security, a terrible threat. I mean, like the other things we're talking about, it's kind of hard to find words. It's and it continues like this. Let's go 10 years forward. Incidentally, what happened at that time? The US moved to a huge increase, enormous increase in military spending. NSC 68, the major Cold War document, declassified a couple of decades ago. Very interesting reading. One should read it, not just for the decisions to massively increase military spending, where the US is, of course, way ahead, but also the rhetoric. The rhetoric is very instructive. The rhetoric is kind of like a fairy tale. Ultimate evil, ultimate perfection. The Russians are ultimate evil. The Kremlin plan for world conquest is built into their nature. It's part of Russia's nature to conquer the whole world. No way to stop them. Ultimate evil. On the other side is ultimate perfection. Us. Our only commitment ever has been to the welfare of the human race. We're angelic. So here you have this confrontation, ultimate evil and ultimate perfection. Let's have an enormous military budget. That's 1950. Goes on like that. Go 10 years further. Kennedy, a dove, supposedly. Khrushchev, Nikita Khrushchev, was then in charge of Russia, Secretary of the Communist Party. He realized that Russia cannot compete with the United States, much poorer country. He wanted to carry out economic development in Russia. He knew that's impossible if there's an arms race. Impossible. So he approached first Eisenhower, then Kennedy, with a proposal to sharply cut back military spending mutually, cut back offensive weapons sharply. In fact, he even went ahead and did it, took the first steps to do it, asking the US to reciprocate. Eisenhower disregarded it. Kennedy administration considered it, rejected it, decided instead to carry forward the largest peacetime arms increase in history, even though they knew the US is way ahead. Well, this is one of the factors that led to the missile crisis. Khrushchev tried to even the balance, practically destroyed the world. Just goes on like that, step by step. Security of the population is simply not a concern for planners. What is a concern is power and profits. Military industry, of course, is a major part of the economy. It's not just the arms producers. So General Motors, for example, is part of it. Machine tools producers are part of it. Everybody's part of it. It's a huge part of the economy. And it's designed in such a way as to have enormous political appeal. So we have this famous triad, 3 branches of the nuclear system: ICBMs, fixed in place. That's 1. Nuclear submarines, nuclear bombers. Those are the 3. Actually, nuclear submarines are more than sufficient. 1 Trident submarine, according to the military, can destroy 200 cities anywhere in the world. That's 1 submarine, now being replaced by more advanced Virginia-class submarines. A couple of those are totally deterrent. The bombers can be shot down. The worst of the 3 is the ICBMs. Every strategic analyst knows they are a threat to the United States. They're fixed place. Their positions are known. They're on the Russian computers. They know where they are. If there's ever a threat of some kind, they're going to be subject to attack. They are what are called use them or lose them missiles. You got to use them or they're going to be lost, which means that if there's some tension in the world, the US has got to shoot them off. Otherwise, they'll be lost. They're a threat to the United States. They do nothing for deterrence. Why are they there? In fact, being enhanced, being improved now. Well, because the Pentagon has scattered them around rural areas all over the country. Some rural county in the Midwest somewhere. It's about the only income source, with industry destroyed under the neoliberal programs. So the local congressman says, I want them here. They bring in some business. It gives you a lot of votes, so you can't touch them. We're harming ourselves, not just harming, threatening ourselves with destruction in order to preserve something which is only of harm to us. Well, combination of political pressures, search for profit, search for power, lack of discussion. You got a lethal mix.
Max Planck said that science advances one funeral at a time. Do you believe that there may come a transitional time in which a new generation of leaders will seek alternatives to militaristic foreign policy?
All I can say is, for 77 years, I've been asking the same question. I'm sure many other people have. There is a huge gap between our technical capacity to destroy and our moral capacity to control the impulse. That became very clear on August 6th, 77 years ago. I remember it very well. I'm sure others my age do as well. It was just like a lightning bolt saying, what's the matter with the human species? We can now destroy, but we are not concerned to control that capacity. Been asking it every day since. Can it be overcome? Well, that's actually maybe the last question we'll ever ask. If it can't be overcome, nothing more is going to matter. If it can be overcome, we can have a bright future. But it's the question that just be along with, can we deal with climate destruction? It's the question that should be at the top of our concerns. And it's not anybody's concern. I don't know if I've mentioned this. If I have, stop me. I keep giving so many talks, I forget what I've mentioned where, but there was a very instructive poll taken a couple of days ago by Yale University. Yale University does regular monitoring, careful monitoring of public attitudes on climate warming. So the last one was just released a couple of days ago. It's very instructive. The design of the poll was to present people with a set of issues and ask them to rank them in importance for voting on the November election. There were 29 choices, so rank them from most to least important. The answers were divided into Democrats and Republicans. One issue was considered by the researchers so unimportant that it wasn't even among the 29, the threat of nuclear war. That's not one of the 29. The threat is expanding right before our eyes to near disaster, but it didn't make the list. Well, global warming made the list. It was 24th on the list among Republicans. For most of them, it was 29th. For some, it made it to 28th. Just the most important questions that have ever arisen in human history, which will determine whether human history continues. Furthermore, I didn't even see a comment on this, except my own. I wrote about it. But you have to wonder what kind of species we are.
Professor, in critiquing the status quo security order, one almost inflexibly meets with the realist-based argument that militarized national security is necessary in an anarchic environment of self-interested states. How would you respond to this proposition?
Well, the dominant theory of international relations, scholarly theory, which is called realism. I should say that in my view, it's dramatically unrealistic, but it's called realism. That's the dominant school. It says what you just said. The world's an anarchic society. States are concerned with their own security and power, and they're going to do anything they can to enhance it. And there's nothing that can be done about it. That's it. We live in that world. That's called realism. John Mearsheimer is one of the famous exponents of it today, but there are many others. What does that mean? It means we're finished. Is it realistic? No, it's not realistic. In fact, there are many historical examples that counter it. Take the history of Europe. It's not an exotic topic. After the Second World War, for centuries, Europeans had been mostly devoted to slaughtering each other. One massacre after another. 30 Years' War in the 17th century, about maybe a third of the population of Germany was wiped out, fighting about how to interpret the Eucharist, real stuff like that. Second World War, the devastation, forgetting atomic weapons, even without that, the devastation was so extreme that Europeans came to understand we just can't play the game anymore. So since 1945, no wars in Europe. In fact, they're cooperating. France and Germany, deadly enemies for centuries, are now cooperating. I mean, it's not impossible. In fact, there are earlier cases. Take the Concert of Europe in 1815. France had been defeated, Napoleon. France wasn't punished. The statesmen of the time, not nice people, but sane, brought France into the concert. They were part of the agreement, an equal part. That led to almost a century of peace in Europe, not total peace, but relative peace by European standards. It can be done. Realism, what's called realism in my view, is just madness. It's, in fact, even a scholarship, it doesn't make any sense. It almost totally ignores the internal structure of the societies. How can you talk about state policy without looking at the internal determinants of policy? Now, that's not everybody. Like there were a few, like Kenneth Waltz, who talked about it a little, but it's basically put to the side. Furthermore, is it true that states seek security? How about what I was just describing? They don't give a damn about security. If we mean security of the population, maybe security of power systems, but not of the population. It's never been a concern for states. So I think it's the only more unrealistic view of school of international relations is its competitor. There are two competitors. One is realism, one is idealism. Idealism says the United States is committed to all good things, Wilsonian idealism. We have to pursue our noble enterprise of bringing peace and justice to the world. Okay, that's even more crazy than realism. That's basically the field of international relations. Now, there's a lot of very good work done there, very good descriptive work. Those fine scholars read their work, say a lot of important things about the world. But the theories themselves, if you want to call them theories, just don't make any sense. And we have to abandon them. What looks like a utopian delusion at one point can mean perfect sense a couple of years later. European Union is a striking example. 1945 was next to inconceivable that Germany and France could become allies, cooperate. A couple of years later, it's exactly what they were doing. I mean, these things aren't immutable.
Professor Chomsky, do you believe that an effective international mechanism for nonviolent conflict resolution can be developed and adopted in the foreseeable future?
Well, there is one, which is in effect the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. That's in effect. It's a UN treaty signed by almost 120 countries, none of the nuclear powers, but that can be changed. So it's in effect. The Non-Proliferation Treaty is in effect. It calls for serious, good faith efforts to eliminate nuclear weapons. All that's on paper, not hypothetical. You could live up to it. There are other things that could be done. There are other steps that can be taken short of total elimination of nuclear weapons to reduce the likelihood of their use. One of them, an important one, is nuclear weapons-free zones. Regions of the world that say we will not tolerate nuclear weapons in this region. It's important, first of all, for limiting their use, but it's also of great symbolic importance. It's telling the world we're not going to tolerate these devices that are going to destroy us. Well, let's take a look at that record. It's very revealing, so revealing that it's never discussed. It's a good sign of how important things are. So let's take a look. There are nuclear weapons-free zones around most of the world. In the Western Hemisphere, of course, it can't be implemented because of the US and Canada. Canada could agree to it. So could the US in principle, but that's a long way. Anyway, that one's there, but can't be implemented. And what about the Pacific? Huge area. There is a nuclear weapons-free zone. At first, it couldn't be implemented because France insisted on using its Pacific Islands for nuclear bombing tests. Well, they stopped that. Now it can't be implemented because the US refuses. It insists on having nuclear facilities on its Pacific Islands. So the Pacific zone can't be implemented. There's an Africa zone, all of Africa, one exception, the island of Diego Garcia, part of Africa, according to the United Nations. It was a British colony. Britain refuses to relinquish it because the United States wants it as a nuclear base. So Britain expelled most of the population, violation of international law, let the US establish a major base there, Diego Garcia, nuclearized under Obama. It's used to bomb Central Asia and the Middle East. So you can't institute the African zone. Well, the most important of all is a Middle East nuclear weapons-free zone, highly volatile area, major threat of nuclear war. So how about a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East? Is there a barrier? Let's take a look. The Arab states are strongly in favor of it. In fact, they've been initiating it for 25 years. Iran is strongly in favor of it. The global South vigorously calling for it. G77, 132 countries. Europe has no objections to it. So why isn't it instituted? US vetoes it. Every time it comes up, US vetoes it. Latest was Obama. It's going to come up again in a couple of weeks. Biden will veto it. Reason? US doesn't want Israel's nuclear arsenal to be inspected. Okay? In fact, the US doesn't even formally admit that Israel has nuclear weapons. Of course it has, everybody knows it. But if the US admitted it, US law would come into effect. And it's arguable that all of US aid to Israel is illegal because Israel is violating several US laws about developing nuclear weapons outside the framework of the NPT. Neither political party wants to open that discussion. The media refuse to discuss it. So here we're facing a serious threat of war ever since Trump pulled out of the joint agreement. Everyone agrees, serious threat of war. Some say the greatest threat. Can't do it because you have to maintain illegal, probably illegal US arms to Israel. Is anybody discussing this? It's another case where it's just off the agenda. It's not a secret. I mean, you can read about it in arms control literature. People like me write about it. We're a free country. Nobody stops us from talking about it, just that nobody can hear. Okay. Well, if those gaps are not, that's a very serious way to reduce the threat of nuclear war. If the US stopped borrowing these nuclear weapons-free zones, most of the world would be free of them. Well, that's a big step forward. Also symbolically, as indicating the horror of these weapons.
Professor, as a follow-on question, you've talked about the disconnect between official conceptions of security and security of populations. How would you go about building a new global security paradigm geared toward common human security and not this militarized conception of zero-sum national security? Would this mean reforming present structures or existing structures in the United Nations? How would you go about building this new framework?
Well, the United Nations in principle, could achieve a great deal to carry forward these and other many significant measures. Could, but it's hampered. The United Nations can act only as far as the great powers will allow. That's just built into the United Nations. If the great powers don't allow something, can't do it. Primarily, that means the United States. In fact, if you look at the last couple of years, the US has hampered the UN for a long time, with a long record. Now it's becoming official in an interesting way. There's a debate going on in the world about what the basic framework of the international order should it be. There's two conceptions. One of them is the UN-based international order. That's the UN Charter, other UN institutions. That's the UN-based system. There's another. It's called the rules-based international order. It's a very interesting concept. What does the rules-based international order mean? Who sets the rules? The United States. So the alternative is the rules-based international order in which the United States sets the rules. Take a look at discourse on this now in the United States. Virtually 100% supporting the rules-based international order, not the UN international order. That's obsolete. We don't want that anymore. There's a good reason why it's obsolete. It bars almost all US foreign policy. The UN-based international order, based on the Charter, bans, quoting, the threat or use of force in international affairs. Threat or use of force. Every American president at least threatens, often uses force. Incidentally, they're all violating the US Constitution, under which the UN Charter is the supreme law of the land. But nobody cares about that either. We're supposed to worship the Constitution, except when it's convenient to forget about it. I've occasionally talked about this in law schools. People kind of nod their heads and say, let's go on to the next question. It just doesn't matter. So we're supposed to support the rules-based international order. Now, this is a major issue in world affairs right now. Most of the world is calling for the UN-based system. The United States, now Europe in its pocket, are saying, no, we want the rules-based system. They're different. Now, the rules-based system permits NATO to do all sorts of things that the UN-based system doesn't allow it to do. That's why the United States sets up what are called coalitions of the willing. You want to invade Iraq, UN-based order won't allow it. So we set up a coalition of the willing, namely Britain, anybody else who's willing to follow us. And then we do it and it becomes legal under the UN, under the rules-based order. The world is splitting over this. There's a great deal of astonishment in the United States today that most of the world, the whole global South, is refusing to join the United States and in the way it's structuring the Ukraine war as a war against Russia. World's not buying that. Saying, yeah, it's a deplorable invasion, but you guys can't get up on a high horse. That's what you do to us all the time. We're not going to get involved in a war against Russia. Try to end this invasion, yes, negotiations, diplomacy, but we're not going to turn it into a war with Russia. US can't understand why the world is taking that position. Well, something we ought to ask ourselves. Why can't we reach the level of civilization of the rest of the world? They're right. We should have the UN-based order, not a US-run rules-based order where we set the rules. Well, that's critical to the kinds of issue that you're talking about. The UN-based order could deal with these questions, could expand the existing treaty on prohibition against nuclear weapons, could set up nuclear weapons-free zones everywhere instead of nowhere. All of these things could be done within a UN-based system, which means within the framework of the US Constitution, according to which the UN Charter is the supreme law of the land, which every elected official must abide by. It's all there on paper. James Madison once said that laws on paper are a parchment barrier. That's all. Unless they're implemented, they're just a piece of paper. That's the kind of barrier they are. Well, we've got to turn them from being a parchment barrier to real, live principles that we fight for and implement.
Ryan and I are actively developing a proposal that would elevate the international security problem of militarism to the same level as the climate crisis, and thus attempt to address it in a holistic way rather than just through piecemeal treaties or agreements. Based on your many decades of anti-war activism, what advice would you offer for our efforts to advance this initiative?
I'm often asked for advice on all kinds of topics. There isn't any, except what we all know. There are old answers. They can work. They're not easy. We all know them. You have to, basically, 3 points. You have to educate, you have to organize, you have to carry out actions which are fine-tuned for circumstances so that they will advance the efforts to educate and organize. That's the tactical side, tricky decisions, what helps and what hurts. That's it. There's no other advice. The things we've all been talking about, almost nobody knows. They're not quantum theory, they're not rocket science. It's all right on the surface. Everything we've been talking about, it's right on the surface. People don't know it. It's not part of their awareness, their immediate consciousness, things they think about. It's got to be brought to that level. There's no special trick for that. It means hard work of education at every level, from neighborhoods to the international institutions, all throughout that. Then we can organize mass protests. Mention the INF Treaty. Didn't come about by a miracle. Came about by mass popular actions, huge demonstrations in Europe and the United States convinced Reagan to accept Gorbachev's offer for the INF Treaty. Okay, that's the way it's done. If there's any other advice, nobody's ever suggested it.
Thank you. I'd like to conclude our interview with a few words of thanks and praise for Professor Chomsky. In 1837, Emerson delivered an address in Cambridge titled The American Scholar. In this famous essay, Emerson presented an ambitious vision for a vigorous new American intellectual culture. He described an expansive concept of scholarship whose characteristics included moral courage. The following words from this essay perfectly describe Noam Chomsky. He is one who raises himself from private considerations and breathes and lives on public and illustrious thoughts. He is the world's eye. He is the world's heart. Thank you, Professor Chomsky. It's been an honor for us to participate in a dialogue with a true American scholar.
Thank you very much. Very kind and generous words. I wish they were appropriate, but I can pretend they are. Thank you. It's been wonderful to be with you. Sorry, I have to take off.
Thank you
And
so much.
wonderful work you're doing. It's essential.